March 1945 marked the final phase of the U.S. Third Army's campaign in Europe. By the final week of March, German military control in western and central Germany had collapsed to a degree unseen earlier in the war. Organized field defenses no longer existed in depth. Fuel shortages immobilized armored formations, and command structures struggled to transmit orders beyond local levels. What remained in the path of advancing American forces were fragments of earlier formations, improvised units, and rear area troops attempting to withdraw eastward. At the center of this advance stood the U.S. Third Army, commanded by General George S. Patton. The Army crossed the Rhine River between 22 and 26 March 1945, using both captured bridges and deliberate assault crossings. Once east of the river, Third Army entered open operational terrain without a continuous German defensive line ahead of it. That fact shaped everything that followed. The operational mission given to Third Army during this phase was clear. The Army was to advance rapidly eastward, destroy or capture remaining German forces in its sector, seize key cities and transportation corridors, and prevent any organized withdrawal toward the interior of Germany. Speed mattered. Momentum mattered. But this advance also operated under strict political constraints. Those constraints centered on one geographic feature: the Elbe River. Long before Third Army reached central Germany, Allied leaders had agreed that the Elbe would serve as the line of contact between Western Allied forces and the Soviet armies advancing from the east. That agreement meant that Patton's objective was not Berlin, despite its proximity by mid-April, but a controlled halt at a predetermined boundary. The presence of that boundary shaped Third Army planning from the start of the Rhine crossings. Corps and division commanders understood that even if German resistance collapsed entirely, movement beyond the Elbe required explicit authorization that was not expected to come. This reality framed the final phase of operations. Once the Rhine was crossed, Third Army reorganized for exploitation rather than deliberate attack. Armored divisions moved to the front, infantry divisions followed to secure rear areas, and engineers focused on keeping road networks open rather than breaching fortified lines. The operational emphasis shifted from breaking defenses to covering distance. From the first days east of the Rhine, the pace accelerated. Columns advanced along multiple axes, often bypassing isolated resistance and leaving follow-on units to secure towns and collect prisoners. Road junctions, rail yards, and bridges became more important than defensive terrain. The result was a rolling advance that covered vast distances in days rather than weeks. Frankfurt am Main fell on 28 March 1945, just days after Third Army crossed the Rhine. Its capture provided a major logistics hub and opened routes deeper into central Germany. From there, Third Army pressed east into Hesse and Thuringia, encountering resistance that varied from short firefights to immediate surrender. The operational environment differed sharply from earlier campaigns. During the fighting in Normandy, Lorraine, and the Ardennes, German forces had repeatedly demonstrated an ability to regroup and counterattack. East of the Rhine, that capability no longer existed. Units encountered by Third Army lacked mobility, coordination, and often basic supplies. The result was an advance driven as much by collapse as by combat. Despite this, Third Army did not advance without structure. The Army operated through multiple corps, each assigned its own axis of advance. This ensured lateral coordination and prevented gaps that could allow German forces to slip westward. It also allowed armored spearheads to push forward without losing contact with adjacent formations. Throughout this movement, Third Army remained under constant direction from higher Allied command. Operational boundaries were enforced. Coordination with neighboring U.S. armies was maintained. Intelligence reports tracked Soviet progress from the east, confirming that the convergence point along the Elbe would soon be reached. By early April 1945, Third Army units were deep inside central Germany. Cities that had once served as administrative and transportation centers fell in rapid succession. German resistance appeared increasingly localized and symbolic rather than operational. In many places, American units entered towns to find German troops waiting to surrender. The scale of German collapse became unmistakable. Entire units surrendered without firing a shot. Columns of soldiers moved westward unarmed, seeking capture. Headquarters staffs abandoned positions or capitulated intact. The German army west of the Elbe no longer functioned as a field force. Yet even as resistance evaporated, Third Army did not exceed its authority. Orders regarding the Elbe were reiterated repeatedly. Reconnaissance patrols could approach the river, but crossings were forbidden. Commanders understood that political considerations now outweighed battlefield opportunity. This produced a rare situation in military history. An advancing army, facing little resistance and possessing overwhelming strength, deliberately stopped short of its maximum reach. The halt at the Elbe was not imposed by German defense, but by Allied agreement. As Third Army moved toward this final line, operational focus shifted again. Security of rear areas became more important. Prisoner processing expanded rapidly. Military government detachments prepared to take control of towns and districts. Combat formations adjusted from pursuit to containment. By mid-April, the character of the campaign had changed. Movement continued, but the objective was no longer destruction of enemy forces alone. It was alignment, coordination, and stabilization ahead of an inevitable end to hostilities. The mission that began at the Rhine now pointed unmistakably toward the Elbe. Third Army would advance as far as ordered, halt where directed, and prepare for the transition from warfighting to occupation. Everything that followed flowed from that framework. March and early April 1945 saw the U.S. Third Army shift fully into exploitation mode, with its advance structured around three primary maneuver formations operating on parallel routes. Once east of the Rhine, Third Army did not concentrate its force on a single axis. Instead, Patton pushed his army forward on a broad front, using multiple corps to cover ground rapidly while denying German forces any chance to regroup between advancing columns. Speed came from dispersion, not mass. At the center of the advance moved She Corps, which became the main thrust element driving directly into central Germany. After crossing the Rhine near Oppenheim on 22-23 March 1945, She Corps turned east and northeast, following the most direct road and rail corridors into Hesse and then Thuringia. This route placed the Corps squarely on the shortest line toward the Elbe. Armored divisions led the movement. The 4th Armored Division and 11th Armored Division pushed forward at high tempo, often advancing for hours without encountering organized resistance. Reconnaissance units ranged far ahead of the main columns, probing towns, bridges, and crossroads before German defenders could organize. When resistance appeared, it rarely delayed movement for long. Behind the armor came infantry divisions tasked with securing what the spearheads bypassed. Towns, supply depots, rail yards, and road junctions were cleared methodically. Prisoners were collected in growing numbers, and traffic control became a constant challenge as German surrender columns mixed with advancing American units. Frankfurt am Main fell directly on She Corps' axis on 28 March 1945, and with its capture the Corps gained access to major transportation networks. From Frankfurt, She Corps drove east toward Fulda, entering the city in early April. That movement carried the Corps into the rolling terrain of Thuringia, where roads narrowed and wooded areas became more common. Even there, momentum held. Resistance consisted mostly of small infantry detachments and isolated strongpoints. Armored units bypassed them when possible, leaving infantry to reduce positions and secure rear areas. The result was a steady eastward flow, rather than a stop-and-start advance. South of She Corps, XX Corps advanced on a parallel but slightly more complex route. XX Corps crossed the Rhine farther south and pushed through northern Bavaria and eastern Hesse before angling northeast into Thuringia. Terrain on this axis was less favorable for rapid movement. Forested areas, hills, and fewer major highways slowed progress compared to the central route. Even so, German opposition remained weak. Units encountered by XX Corps were often retreating rather than defending. Many surrendered at roadblocks or after brief exchanges of fire. Vehicles abandoned for lack of fuel-lined secondary roads, and German columns attempting to move east were intercepted repeatedly. XX Corps infantry divisions advanced deliberately, securing towns and cutting off retreat routes. Armored support remained available, but was used selectively due to terrain constraints. The focus here was containment as much as speed, preventing German forces from slipping south or regrouping in mountainous regions. To the north, the 8th Corps performed a different role. Rather than driving straight toward the Elbe, the 8th Corps advanced eastward while maintaining 3rd Army's left boundary and coordination with adjacent U.S. armies. This corps secured northern Hesse and central German territory that could otherwise have become a gap between Allied formations. The 8th Corps' operations emphasized control over depth. Secondary roads, river crossings, and small towns were secured to ensure that German units could not move west behind the faster spearheads. This work prevented the formation of bypassed enemy pockets and stabilized the overall advance. Across all 3 corps, the pattern repeated. Armored units advanced rapidly along primary routes. Infantry followed to secure terrain and process prisoners. Engineers repaired bridges and roads rather than breaching fortified positions. Logistics units struggled to keep pace with columns that often advanced faster than supply plans anticipated. What nobody expected earlier in the war now became routine. Entire German units surrendered without resistance. Headquarters staffs capitulated intact. Columns of soldiers appeared along roads carrying white flags or improvised signs. Prisoner handling became a logistical issue rather than a tactical one. Coordination between corps proved decisive. C Corps' central thrust prevented German forces from establishing any new line in Thuringia. 6 Corps' movement cut off southern escape routes. The 8th Corps sealed the northern boundary. Together, these axes collapsed the German position west of the Elbe without requiring a final set-piece battle. Despite the speed, command control remained tight. Advance limits were enforced. Corps commanders stayed within assigned sectors. Intelligence updates tracked Soviet movement from the east, reinforcing the reality that the advance would end at a fixed line, regardless of battlefield conditions. By mid-April 1945, the routes taken by CI, XX, and the 8 Corps converged toward the same outcome. All 3 corps oriented their movements toward river lines leading to the Elbe. The Saal and Mulde rivers became intermediate objectives, crossed or reached with minimal resistance. Beyond them lay the final boundary. The structure of the advance now mattered more than combat. 3rd Army's corps routes determined where American units would halt, where contact with Soviet forces would occur, and how occupation zones would later be defined. Movement was no longer about chasing a retreating enemy, but about arriving at the right place in the right alignment. These corps' advances defined the geography of the war's end for 3rd Army. They explain why American units stood where they did in April 1945, why the Elbe became the stopping point, and why the campaign concluded without a final climactic engagement. As 3rd Army's corps pushed east along their assigned routes in late March and April 1945, the German forces they encountered bore little resemblance to the field armies that had fought in France, Lorraine, or the Ardennes. By the time American units crossed the Rhine, the German army in central Germany no longer functioned as a coherent fighting force. The destruction of armored reserves in the west, the loss of fuel supplies, and the breakdown of command networks had stripped remaining units of mobility and coordination. What stood in 3rd Army's path were fragments rather than formations. German opposition consisted primarily of remnants from earlier campaigns. These included depleted Wehrmacht infantry units, shattered Volksgrenadier divisions, training battalions pulled from schools and depots, and rear area personnel reassigned to emergency defense roles. In many cases, unit designations no longer reflected actual strength or capability. Companies operated at platoon size. Battalions fielded a few hundred men at most. Fuel shortages defined German limitations more than any other factor. Armored vehicles, where they existed at all, were frequently abandoned along roadsides or parked immobile in towns. Tanks and assault guns lacked the fuel required to maneuver, and were often used as static roadblocks or simply left behind. Third Army units regularly encountered intact vehicles with empty fuel tanks and no crews nearby. Command authority had fragmented down to the local level. Orders from higher headquarters often failed to arrive. Radios no longer functioned reliably, and wired communications had been destroyed or abandoned. German officers frequently exercised authority only over the men physically present with them, without knowledge of neighboring units or broader operational plans. That breakdown shaped how resistance appeared on the ground. In some towns, small groups attempted to organize defenses using machine guns, Panzerfausts, or light artillery. These defenses lacked depth and coordination. Once American armor or artillery engaged, resistance collapsed quickly. Engagements measured in hours earlier in the war now lasted minutes. In many areas, resistance never materialized at all. German soldiers surrendered at first contact or before contact occurred. American reconnaissance patrols reported encountering white flags displayed from buildings. Vehicles stopped at road junctions with soldiers waiting to surrender, and columns of troops marching west without weapons. The composition of surrendering forces varied widely. Among prisoners were regular infantrymen, administrative clerks, medics, drivers, engineers, and members of support services. Many had never fired their weapons in combat. Others had fought earlier in the war and recognized that further resistance served no practical purpose. Age disparities were striking. Third Army reports repeatedly noted the presence of older men mobilized late in the war and very young soldiers drawn from emergency formations. Training levels were inconsistent, equipment was often obsolete or incomplete, and morale had deteriorated beyond recovery. Where resistance did occur, it followed recognizable patterns. Some German units attempted brief delaying actions to allow civilians or other troops to withdraw eastward. Others defended symbolic locations such as barracks, administrative buildings, or bridges. These efforts rarely involved coordinated maneuver and ended once American units threatened encirclement. Urban resistance remained limited. Cities such as Eisenach, Gotha, and Erfurt saw isolated fighting around specific facilities, including rail yards and command buildings. Once American forces penetrated these areas or bypassed them entirely, organized resistance ended. There were no prolonged street battles comparable to earlier fighting in Aachen or Metz. German artillery played almost no role during this phase. Shortages of ammunition and functioning guns rendered artillery ineffective. When artillery fire did occur, it was brief and uncoordinated. American counter-battery fire suppressed gun positions quickly, often before German units could adjust or sustain fire. Air support from the Luftwaffe was virtually non-existent. German aircraft rarely appeared over the battlefield, and when they did, their presence had no meaningful effect on American operations. Allied air superiority limited German movement during daylight hours and further eroded morale among ground troops. Attempts at counterattack were rare and ineffective. Isolated armored or infantry groups occasionally attempted local counterattacks against advancing American units. These actions lacked strength and coordination. They were repelled quickly by combined arms responses involving armor, infantry, artillery, and air support. The logistical collapse behind German lines accelerated surrender. Food shortages, lack of medical care, and absence of transportation left units unable to sustain even limited operations. Wounded soldiers could not be evacuated. Ammunition resupply was sporadic or non-existent. Under these conditions, surrender became the only viable option for many units. American intelligence assessments reflected this reality. Reports described German forces as disorganized, leaderless, and incapable of sustained defense. These assessments were consistent across corps and divisions and matched observations made by frontline units advancing through central Germany. Despite the collapse, Third Army did not treat the advance casually. Reconnaissance elements remained active. Flank security was maintained. Engineers cleared mines and obstacles were encountered. Units remained alert for ambushes and isolated resistance, particularly in wooded areas and built-up zones. This caution prevented surprises. Even as resistance declined, American units avoided unnecessary risk. Bypassed areas were secured methodically. Prisoners were disarmed immediately and moved rearward to prevent congestion along advance routes. The pattern of resistance shaped Third Army's operational tempo. With no continuous German front to breach, American commanders prioritized speed and maneuver. Armored spearheads pushed forward aggressively, while infantry and rear area units handled the growing burden of prisoner processing and security. By mid-April 1945, German military resistance west of the Elbe in the Third Army sector had effectively ended. Remaining German personnel consisted of isolated individuals, small groups attempting to avoid capture, or rear area staff without weapons or leadership. No formation capable of coordinated defense remained in place. The collapse did not occur suddenly. It unfolded progressively as Third Army advanced, cutting off retreat routes, capturing logistics hubs, and dismantling command structures. Each advance reduced German capability further, until resistance ceased almost entirely. This condition defined the final weeks of the war in central Germany. The end came not through a single decisive battle, but through cumulative collapse driven by attrition, isolation, and loss of command and supply. Third Army's experience during this phase reflected the final disintegration of German military power in the West. Late March and early April 1945 marked the most visible milestones of Third Army's final advance, as major cities and transportation centers fell in rapid succession. The first major urban objective on Third Army's axis was Frankfurt am Main. On 28 March 1945, American units entered Frankfurt after advancing east from the Rhine crossings. German resistance inside the city proved limited and uneven. Small groups attempted local defense around administrative buildings and road junctions, but these efforts collapsed once American armored elements entered the outskirts and moved toward the city center. Frankfurt's importance extended beyond its size. The city served as a critical rail and road hub linking western Germany to central regions. Its capture opened multiple eastbound routes and allowed Third Army to move supply, fuel, and reinforcements forward without delay. Once secured, Frankfurt immediately transitioned into a logistical base supporting continued movement. From Frankfurt, Third Army shifted its focus toward Fulda. Fulda lay along a key corridor leading into Thuringia, and its control denied German forces access to one of the most direct east-west routes in central Germany. American units advanced toward the city in the closing days of March and entered it in early April 1945. Resistance in Fulda followed the same pattern seen elsewhere. Small German units attempted brief delaying actions on approach roads and at select intersections. Once American armor appeared, resistance ended quickly. German troops withdrew or surrendered, and the city fell without prolonged fighting. The fall of Fulda opened the door into Thuringia. From this point forward, Third Army operated in terrain characterized by rolling hills, forests, and mid-sized industrial towns rather than large metropolitan centers. Despite the change in geography, the pace of advance did not slow. One of the next significant cities taken was Eisenach. American units entered Eisenach on 6 April 1945. Located near important rail lines and road networks, the city held tactical value despite its smaller size. German defenders attempted limited resistance on the outskirts, but these efforts lacked coordination and depth. Once American units penetrated the perimeter, German resistance collapsed. Infantry and armored units moved through the city methodically, securing key points and disarming remaining defenders. Eisenach fell within a short time frame, continuing the pattern of rapid city captures during this phase. The following day, 7 April 1945, Third Army entered Gotha. Gotha's defenses were minimal. German forces in the area consisted largely of small infantry detachments and administrative personnel. Some resistance occurred near transportation facilities, but it ended quickly once American units established control of major intersections. With Gotha secured, Third Army tightened its grip on central Thuringia. The capture of these cities disrupted remaining German movement across the region and eliminated any possibility of establishing a defensive line west of the Elbe. Attention then shifted toward Erfurt, one of the larger urban centers in the region. Erfurt was entered on 12 April 1945. German forces attempted limited defense around selected positions, including barracks and rail facilities. These efforts lacked artillery support and coordination, and they collapsed once American units advanced into the city proper. The capture of Erfurt marked the effective end of organized German control across much of Thuringia. Its fall severed remaining transportation links and administrative authority in the region. German units attempting to move east were intercepted or surrendered before reaching the Elbe. During this same period, Third Army secured numerous smaller towns and cities. Places such as Bad Hersfeld, Weimar, and surrounding communities were occupied as part of the continuous advance. In many cases, German authorities surrendered these towns without resistance, either by withdrawing forces or by approaching American units directly to hand over control. The occupation of Weimar occurred in early April 1945. The city itself fell without significant fighting. Nearby areas, however, became notable for another reason. On 4 April 1945, American units operating in the vicinity encountered the Ohrdruf camp complex. This discovery occurred during routine security operations following the capture of nearby towns, and did not alter Third Army's movement toward the east. City capture followed a consistent operational pattern. Armored reconnaissance elements moved ahead of main forces to assess resistance. Infantry followed to clear remaining defenders and secure buildings. Engineers inspected and repaired bridges, rail yards, and utilities. Military police established control points and managed prisoner processing. This process allowed Third Army to move through urban areas quickly without becoming bogged down. Cities rarely became obstacles. Instead, they functioned as waypoints that supported continued movement by providing roads, depots, and shelter for advancing units. By mid-April 1945, all major cities west of the Elbe within Third Army's sector had fallen. No significant urban centers remained under German control. Transportation networks were either seized intact or rendered unusable to German forces. Administrative authority collapsed alongside military resistance. The speed of these captures reflected the broader condition of German forces. Urban defenses lacked depth, heavy weapons, and coordination. Once American units entered a city, resistance ended quickly. Unlike earlier campaigns, there were no prolonged street battles or drawn-out sieges during this phase. The cumulative effect of these city captures was decisive. German forces west of the Elbe lost their ability to maneuver, communicate, or reorganize. Each captured city tightened the noose, forcing remaining units into surrender or flight. By the time Third Army approached the Saal and Mulde rivers, the outcome was clear. The capture of Frankfurt, Fulda, Eisenach, Gotha, Erfurt, and numerous smaller towns had dismantled German control across central Germany. What remained was the final approach to the Elbe and the enforcement of the boundary agreed upon by Allied leaders. By early April 1945, the Third Army's advance produced a development that reshaped daily operations across the front. German resistance did not simply weaken, it collapsed into mass surrender on a scale that exceeded anything American forces had previously experienced in Europe. As armored and infantry units moved deeper into central Germany, German formations increasingly ceased attempting organized withdrawal. Instead of retreating under cover or forming rear guards, entire groups surrendered wherever American forces appeared. Roads, villages, and open fields became surrender points rather than battlefields. The scale expanded rapidly. What began as company-sized capitulations grew into battalion and regimental surrenders within days. American after-action reports from early April consistently described encounters in which hundreds of German soldiers surrendered simultaneously, often without firing a shot. These were not isolated incidents, but repeated patterns across all Third Army Corps sectors. Many of these surrenders occurred along road networks. German soldiers moved west in columns, frequently unarmed, attempting to reach American lines before Soviet forces closed in from the east. When intercepted by American units, these columns halted and surrendered en masse. Officers often stepped forward to identify themselves, followed by entire formations laying down weapons. The collapse of command authority was visible at every level. German officers surrendered alongside enlisted men, sometimes still carrying unit paperwork, maps, and records. In several cases, headquarters staff surrendered intact, including clerks, signal personnel, and logistics officers. Orders had ceased to flow, and many officers concluded that continued resistance had no operational value. Logistics failure accelerated the process. German units lacked fuel, ammunition, food, and medical supplies. Vehicles were immobilized along roads or abandoned entirely. Wounded personnel had no evacuation capability. Without transport or resupply, units could not maneuver or sustain defense even if they had wanted to. Third Army units adapted quickly to the surge. Military police detachments were reassigned to manage prisoners. Temporary holding areas were established near major roads and towns. Infantry units often diverted entire companies to guard prisoners, while armored spearheads continued advancing eastward. Prisoner numbers exceeded planning assumptions. In multiple corps sectors, daily prisoner counts reached into the thousands. Processing facilities designed for far smaller numbers were overwhelmed. American units improvised, using open fields, fenced areas, and abandoned facilities to hold prisoners temporarily before transfer to rear areas. The diversity of prisoners reflected the collapse of German institutions. Among those captured were frontline infantry, supply drivers, mechanics, medics, engineers, railway workers, and administrative personnel. Some had been pulled from rear areas or training establishments days earlier, and issued weapons with minimal instruction. Age differences were striking. Reports described elderly men mobilized late in the war surrendering alongside teenagers from emergency formations. Many lacked proper uniforms or equipment. Training levels varied widely, and morale had deteriorated beyond recovery. Resistance during this phase became rare and localized. Where German units attempted to fight, engagements were brief. Once American armor or artillery appeared, defenders surrendered or withdrew. There were no sustained counterattacks or coordinated defensive lines west of the Elbe during this period. The psychological dimension of surrender became evident. German soldiers frequently expressed concern about Soviet capture and sought American units specifically. This motivation drove many westward movements and accelerated capitulation once contact was made. Third Army commanders adjusted operational priorities. Speed remained important, but prisoner handling became an operational constraint. Armored units bypassed surrendering groups to avoid congestion, leaving infantry and rear area units to secure prisoners later. This approach preserved momentum while preventing the advance from stalling. Entire areas changed hands without combat. Towns surrendered upon approach. Civil authorities presented keys, documents, and local police forces to American units. German military presence in these areas often consisted of small groups awaiting capture rather than defending positions. The scale of surrender reached its peak as Third Army approached the Saale and Mulde rivers. German units retreating from multiple directions converged into shrinking areas and surrendered simultaneously. The convergence of American corps axes left German forces with no remaining avenues of escape westward. By mid-April 1945, Third Army had captured hundreds of thousands of prisoners. Exact figures varied by report and date, but the trend was unmistakable. The number of prisoners taken far exceeded the number of enemy soldiers engaged in combat during this phase of the campaign. Combat units transitioned into administrative roles. Prisoner escort, food distribution, medical screening, and transport coordination became daily tasks. Supply units diverted resources to sustain prisoners temporarily before transfer to permanent enclosures. Despite the volume, discipline remained strict. Prisoners were disarmed immediately, segregated by rank where possible, and moved rearward under guard. Standing orders emphasized control, security, and continued forward movement of combat elements. German military capability west of the Elbe effectively ceased. What remained were isolated individuals attempting to avoid capture, small groups hiding in forests or buildings, and administrative personnel without weapons or authority. No formation capable of organized resistance survived intact. The mass surrender phase confirmed the strategic outcome. German forces could no longer influence the course of the war in central Germany. The advance to the Elbe had achieved its objective not through a final decisive battle, but through systematic collapse. This phase reshaped the character of operations. Third Army shifted from maneuver warfare to containment, stabilization, and preparation for occupation. The battlefield became an administrative space rather than a contested one. The prisoner collapse also altered the tempo of the advance. Movement continued, but with greater emphasis on coordination, security, and boundary alignment. The urgency of pursuit gave way to controlled positioning ahead of the Elbe. By the time Third Army approached the final river line, resistance had ended almost entirely. The war, in practical terms, was already over west of the Elbe. What remained was enforcement of the boundary, coordination with Soviet forces, and preparation for surrender. As Third Army pushed deeper into central Germany in early April 1945, rear areas that had only days earlier been under German control were opened abruptly by the speed of the advance. What American units encountered in these areas emerged not from planned objectives, but from routine security sweeps, road clearances, and occupation tasks that followed the collapse of German resistance. One of the earliest and most consequential discoveries occurred near the town of Ohrdruf in Thuringia. On 4 April 1945, American units operating in the area entered a facility later identified as a subcamp connected to the Buchenwald camp system. The site lay within territory secured during normal movement eastward following the capture of nearby towns and road networks. No special operation had been planned to locate it. The camp was encountered because German authority in the area had disintegrated. The discovery unfolded during standard rear area clearing operations. American troops securing abandoned installations and buildings found evidence of detention activity, including barracks, administrative structures, and physical traces indicating the recent presence of prisoners. German guards had withdrawn before American arrival, leaving the site unsecured. Reports were filed immediately through command channels. Unit-level officers notified higher headquarters, and the discovery was relayed upward through Corps and Army command. The site was secured, and access was restricted to prevent disturbance of evidence while documentation began. Within days, senior officers visited the site. Commanders assigned to Third Army, along with other Allied officers, were brought to Ohrdruf to observe conditions directly. These visits were recorded through photographs and written reports, which became part of the official Army record. The purpose was verification and documentation, rather than operational decision-making. The discovery occurred while Third Army remained fully engaged in its eastward advance. Frontline units continued moving toward the Saal and Mulde rivers. Responsibility for securing and documenting the camp shifted to follow-on units and rear area personnel, allowing combat formations to maintain momentum. Ohrdruf was not the only facility encountered. As German control collapsed across central Germany, American units came across smaller detention sites, prisons, and holding facilities tied to military or security organizations. Each was secured in the same manner, documented and reported without interrupting the broader operational plan. The pattern remained consistent. Advance elements moved forward. Rear area units secured territory. Facilities encountered were recorded and preserved. Evidence was gathered methodically, not theatrically, and forwarded through established channels. Medical personnel were brought in where survivors were present. Units provided immediate assistance within available resources, while longer-term responsibility transitioned to specialized teams and occupation authorities. These actions occurred alongside, not instead of, ongoing military operations. The timing of these discoveries reflected the speed of the collapse. German authorities had neither the time nor the capacity to dismantle facilities or conceal evidence before American arrival. Guards withdrew or fled. Records and structures were often left intact. Third Army units encountered no organized attempts to defend or destroy the sites. By early April, German forces lacked the coordination and resources to mount such actions. The disappearance of Guard units mirrored the broader breakdown of German command authority throughout the region. Documentation followed established military procedures. Photographs, reports, and witness statements were collected at multiple levels. Unit reports formed the first layer, followed by corps summaries and Army-level documentation. This material later became part of the permanent historical and legal record. The discoveries did not alter Third Army's operational objectives. The mission remained the same: advance east, eliminate remaining German resistance west of the Elbe, and halt at the agreed boundary. Camp encounters occurred in territory already secured and did not require diversion of frontline forces. Rear area organization expanded rapidly during this period. As combat activity declined, units transitioned toward occupation tasks. Military government detachments moved forward. Security responsibilities increased. The handling of discovered facilities became part of stabilization rather than combat operations. The Ohrdruf discovery assumed broader significance after the advance concluded. It became one of the first camps encountered by American ground forces inside Germany. Documentation produced during those early days was later referenced in official histories and post-war proceedings. Within the context of Third Army's advance, however, the discovery was one element among many. It occurred alongside mass surrenders, collapsing administrations, and the final approach to the Elbe. It did not slow the advance or change its direction, but it did shape the historical record of what American forces found as German control vanished. By mid-April, responsibility for managing discovered sites shifted fully to occupation authorities. Frontline units no longer encountered new facilities as the advance narrowed toward the Elbe. The focus turned to boundary enforcement, security, and coordination with Allied partners. This phase marked a transition in the character of operations. Combat maneuver gave way to stabilization. Movement continued, but with different priorities and responsibilities. The discoveries made in rear areas underscored the conditions present in territories newly secured by American forces. As Third Army approached its final halt, the operational environment changed again. What remained was the enforcement of the Elbe boundary, the establishment of contact with Soviet forces, and preparation for the formal end of hostilities. By mid-April 1945, the character of Third Army operations shifted again, not because of renewed German resistance, but because the Army had reached the outer edge of its authority. The drive east that began at the Rhine now narrowed toward a single geographic limit that governed every decision that followed. That limit was the Elbe River. Long before Third Army reached central Germany, Allied leaders had agreed that the Elbe would serve as the line separating Western Allied forces from the advancing Soviet armies. This agreement was political as much as military. and by April 1945 it carried greater weight than any remaining German formation west of the river. Orders reinforcing this boundary arrived repeatedly at Third Army headquarters. Corps and division commanders were instructed that the Elbe marked the eastern limit of advance. Units were authorized to approach the river, secure terrain on its western bank, and establish observation and defensive positions. Crossing the river without explicit authorization was prohibited under all circumstances. These orders shaped how the final advance unfolded. Rather than driving blindly east, Third Army adjusted its tempo and alignment. Corps axes narrowed. Reconnaissance patrols extended forward to identify river approaches and crossing sites, while main bodies advanced more deliberately, ensuring that positions along intermediate river lines were secured properly. The final approach unfolded in stages. Before reaching the Elbe, Third Army encountered two significant river obstacles, the Saale and the Mulde. These rivers did not represent defensive lines in the traditional sense, but they did define the geography of the final advance. Elements of Third Army reached the Saale River between 11 and 13 April 1945. German resistance along the Saale was minimal. Units assigned to defend the river lacked manpower, coordination, and heavy weapons. In many locations, German troops withdrew or surrendered before American forces arrived at the riverbanks. Where crossings were required, engineers moved quickly. Bridges damaged during earlier fighting were repaired, and temporary crossings were established as needed. The emphasis remained on maintaining momentum while avoiding unnecessary risk or congestion. After the Saale, attention shifted toward the Mulde River. The Mulde represented the last significant water barrier west of the Elbe. As Third Army units approached it, reconnaissance patrols reported little organized German activity on the far bank. Resistance again consisted mainly of isolated infantry groups or administrative personnel attempting to move east. Crossings of the Mulde occurred without major engagement. German units either surrendered or dispersed before American forces reached them. In some cases, bridges remained intact simply because German forces lacked the means or coordination to destroy them in time. As Third Army crossed these final river lines, intelligence reports increasingly emphasized Soviet proximity. Reconnaissance patrols, aerial observation, and intercepted communications confirmed that Red Army units were advancing rapidly from the east. In some areas, Soviet forces were already operating within sight of the Elbe's eastern bank. This information reinforced the importance of restraint. Commanders were reminded that unauthorized contact or movement beyond the Elbe could produce dangerous misunderstandings. Identification procedures were reviewed. Liaison plans were finalized. Boundaries were clarified at every level of command. The operational focus now shifted from pursuit to positioning. Third Army units advanced to the Elbe deliberately, selecting defensible ground on the western bank and securing towns, road junctions, and high ground overlooking the river. Patrols moved forward to observe activity across the river but halted at the water's edge. By mid-April 1945, forward elements of Third Army reached the Elbe at multiple points. Units occupied positions facing towns such as Dessau, Torgau, and other smaller crossing points within the Army's sector. In each case, movement stopped by order, not by enemy action. This halt marked a sharp contrast with the preceding weeks. Since crossing the Rhine, Third Army had advanced almost continuously. Resistance had collapsed. Opportunities for deeper penetration had multiplied. Yet at the Elbe, movement ceased abruptly. The reason was not tactical. German forces east of the river still existed, but they were no longer Third Army's responsibility. The war's final geography had been decided at the strategic level, and field commanders were expected to comply. Once positions along the Elbe were secured, Third Army reorganized its posture. Defensive positions were established facing east. Observation posts monitored movement across the river. Bridges were guarded or rendered unusable to prevent unauthorized crossings in either direction. Rear area functions expanded again. As the front stabilized, military government detachments moved forward to assume control of territory already cleared. Civil administration, traffic control, and supply distribution became routine tasks. Combat formations adapted to static positions rather than mobile operations. German personnel encountered west of the Elbe continued to surrender. Small groups, isolated individuals, and rear-area staff emerged from towns and forests to give themselves up. These surrenders were processed quickly and moved rearward, ensuring that the Elbe line remained clear of congestion. Throughout this period, discipline regarding the boundary remained strict. Despite the knowledge that Berlin lay only a short distance beyond the river, no unauthorized crossings occurred. Orders were enforced consistently across corps and divisions, reflecting the priority placed on coordination with Soviet forces. By 20 April 1945, Third Army's position along the Elbe had stabilized fully. No organized German resistance remained west of the river within the Army's sector. The operational objectives assigned after the Rhine crossings had been completed in full. The advance that began with assault crossings in March now ended with a deliberate halt in April. The transition was not dramatic in a battlefield sense, but it was decisive. Third Army had reached the final line designated for Western Allied forces in central Germany. From this point forward, operations no longer involved maneuver warfare. The mission shifted to containment, security, and coordination. Patrols observed rather than advanced. Orders emphasized identification, communication, and restraint. This phase illustrated a defining feature of the war's end. Military capability no longer dictated movement. Political agreements did. The Elbe became not just a river, but a boundary between armies, ideologies, and post-war zones of control. Third Army's approach to the Elbe demonstrated that reality clearly. The Army arrived intact, disciplined, and in control of its sector. It stopped where ordered. It prepared for what came next. By late April 1945, Third Army had completed its final movement of the war and stood in fixed positions along the western bank of the Elbe. What followed was not another advance, but a carefully managed conclusion shaped by coordination, restraint, and the formal end of hostilities in Europe. As American units settled into their positions, reconnaissance patrols confirmed the presence of Soviet Red Army formations on the opposite bank of the river. In several locations, Soviet troops were visible across open ground or through binoculars, occupying towns and road networks east of the Elbe. The convergence of Allied forces, long anticipated at higher command levels, had now occurred on the ground. Orders governing contact were explicit and tightly enforced. American units were authorized to establish identification and liaison only under controlled conditions. Patrols approaching the river were required to display clear markings, avoid sudden movement, and halt at the water's edge. Any engagement beyond identification was prohibited. These procedures were designed to prevent misunderstandings at a moment when two massive armies were operating in close proximity. Formal contact between American and Soviet forces occurred on 25 April 1945 at Torgau, a town located on the Elbe. Patrols from the U.S. Army and the Red Army met there, confirming that the Western Allied and Soviet fronts had joined. Although this meeting involved units of the U.S. First Army, Third Army formations were simultaneously reaching and holding positions along the Elbe further south. Within days, Third Army patrols also established liaison contact with Soviet units in their own sector. These contacts followed standardized procedures. Officers exchanged identification, confirmed unit boundaries, and reported the encounters through command channels. No joint operations were conducted. Each force remained within its assigned zone, respecting the boundary agreed upon earlier by Allied leadership. Once contact was confirmed, Third Army's operational role changed immediately. Combat formations shifted fully into a defensive and security posture. Observation posts were established overlooking the river. Roadblocks and checkpoints controlled movement in rear areas. Bridges were secured or disabled to prevent unauthorized crossings in either direction. German military resistance west of the Elbe had effectively ceased. Any German personnel encountered during this phase surrendered without resistance. These included isolated soldiers, administrative staff, and small groups attempting to avoid capture. All were disarmed and processed as prisoners of war, then moved westward to established holding areas. Prisoner processing continued at a high volume. Although the peak of mass surrender had passed, Third Army units still handled thousands of captives during the final weeks of April. Military police units remained heavily engaged, coordinating transport, security, and logistics, while combat units transitioned toward static duties. With the front stabilized, occupation responsibilities expanded rapidly. Military government detachments moved into towns and cities already secured during the advance. Civil administrations were disarmed or dissolved. Local officials were directed to comply with American authority, and essential services such as transportation, utilities, and food distribution were placed under military supervision. Coordination with Soviet forces remained a priority. Liaison officers ensured that boundary lines were understood and respected at all levels. Reports flowed continuously between Corps and Army headquarters to confirm positions and prevent accidental contact or unauthorized movement. Despite the proximity of Soviet forces, the situation remained controlled. No incidents involving American and Soviet units were recorded in the Third Army sector during this phase. The boundary along the Elbe held, and both sides adhered to agreed procedures. On 7 May 1945, Germany signed an unconditional surrender. The surrender took effect on 8 May 1945, formally ending hostilities in Europe. When the surrender became effective, Third Army units were already in fixed positions west of the Elbe, performing security and occupation duties rather than combat operations. The surrender did not prompt any movement eastward. The Elbe boundary remained in effect after hostilities ended. Soviet forces occupied territory east of the river, while American forces held positions to the west. The line established during the final advance became the de facto division between Allied zones. Following the surrender, Third Army transitioned entirely into occupation roles. Combat formations reorganized for patrol, guard, and administrative duties. Units secured supply depots, transportation hubs, and prisoner facilities. Displaced civilians and former forced laborers moved through the area in large numbers, requiring coordination and control. German military institutions ceased functioning altogether. Remaining headquarters dissolved. Weapons were surrendered. Records were seized or secured. No further military resistance occurred within the Third Army sector. The end of combat did not mean the end of responsibility. Third Army units remained in place to maintain order, enforce directives, and support the transition to post-war administration. Coordination with other Allied forces continued as occupation zones solidified. From an operational standpoint, Third Army's final campaign concluded exactly as planned. The Army crossed the Rhine in late March. It advanced rapidly through central Germany. It captured major cities, accepted mass surrenders, and halted at the Elbe in April. It established contact with Soviet forces and remained in place through Germany's surrender in early May. No final battle marked the end. Instead, the campaign closed with alignment and restraint. The decisive moments had already passed. What remained was execution of agreed boundaries and preparation for peace. The advance to the Elbe represented the final combat phase of Third Army's role in the European War. It demonstrated how a modern army concluded operations not through total destruction of the enemy, but through control, coordination, and adherence to higher strategic direction. The factual record is clear. Dates, locations, unit movements, and outcomes define this final phase. Third Army completed its assigned mission and transitioned to occupation without deviation from orders. With Germany's surrender in effect, the war in Europe ended. For Third Army, the movement stopped at the Elbe, and with it ended the last chapter of its wartime operations.